How can governments really push industries to decarbonize?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
It is. It really is. And the question we're diving into today is what are the most effective actions they can take?
Right.
We're going to give you some real clarity because we've gone deep into a wide range of strategies here.
We have. And you know what we're focusing on is the International Energy Agency's report,
Yeah.
Policy Toolbox for Industrial Decarbonization.
Oh.
This is really a practical toolkit.
Oh, yeah.
It builds on IEA's 2022 analysis of achieving net zero heavy industry
Okay.
in G7 nations.
Gotcha.
And this was developed as part of the Climate Club's work program.
I see. So this IEA report is kind of like a collection of policy instruments
It is.
to help governments all over the globe design and implement their own industrial decarbonization strategies.
Exactly.
So it's really a detailed look at key policy areas, the specific tools within those areas,
Right.
and really important, the critical factors to consider when putting these things into practice.
Yeah. And it even draws on real-world policy mapping from major steel and cement-producing countries,
Oh, wow.
including members of the Climate Club.
So this is really in the weeds of
Yes.
what can be done.
It is.
What are we doing with all this information today?
So our mission today is to extract the essential knowledge from this IEA policy toolbox. We really want you, the listener,
Yeah,
to grasp the huge variety of governmental actions that are available.
right.
But more importantly, we want you to understand the factors that determine
Okay.
if a particular policy is the right fit and how effective it might be
Makes sense.
in actually achieving industrial decarbonization.
So it's about really cutting through the complexity
I think
and
so.
giving the listeners a solid understanding of
Yeah.
what's involved. Okay, so let's get into this. The IEA report organizes its policy recommendations into three broad categories. The first one is framework fundamentals. What does that set the stage for?
So Framework Fundamentals is about laying the groundwork. It's about establishing that core foundation for any country that is serious about industrial decarbonization.
Makes sense.
And it includes creating those clear long-term signals for the market,
Right.
developing comprehensive action plans, and figuring out how to mobilize the finance
Yeah.
and investment that will be required.
It's like you can't just jump in and start doing things
Ex-
without having that broader strategy laid out.
Exactly.
So the first element within this framework is establishing plans and policies for long-term greenhouse gas or GHG emission reductions.
Yes.
What's the thinking behind that?
So the main idea is to create a very clear, strong, and predictable long-term policy signal for reducing emissions.
Gotcha.
And this involves formally communicating their intended path forward
Okay.
through roadmaps, plans, specific targets.
Right.
And it also includes incentive and regulatory policy instruments. Things like carbon pricing mechanisms, emission trading systems.
So it's about setting that direction
Exactly.
before you actually get into the projects.
Exactly.
And the report really emphasizes the importance of explicit and quantifiable objectives.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
Because vague goals are likely to lead to only incremental changes.
Okay.
Things like small improvements in energy or material efficiency, a bit more scrap metal and steel production,
Right.
adding some supplementary materials to cement, coal.
Those are steps in the right direction.
Those are steps.
But they're not getting to that big change that needs to happen.
Exactly. They're not going to get us to that deep, transformative decarbonization that we need in the long run.
And what makes these plans and policies truly effective?
So a few key elements that stand out.
Huh.
Having legally binding components,
Okay.
clearly defined roles and responsibilities,
Right.
action plans with specific checkpoints, measurable results,
Gotcha.
supported by publicly accessible data,
Transparency, yeah.
transparency, dedicated budgets, signal a real commitment,
Yeah.
a designated body in charge of monitoring keeps things on track.
Yeah.
And importantly, mechanisms to prevent deviations from the plan's core objectives.
So it really needs all those pieces
Yeah.
to be a robust framework.
It does.
The report also mentions international collaboration at this early stage.
Yes.
How can that be helpful in developing these plans?
Well, knowledge sharing is incredibly valuable.
Okay.
Governments can learn a lot from each other's experiences, how they engage stakeholders, which technology options they're considering,
Right.
how they're designing and implementing their plans,
Makes sense.
how they measure outcomes.
Yeah.
Reviewing other countries' existing roadmaps and targets can provide crucial insights
Yeah.
and help avoid reinventing the wheel. Additionally, some national governments and international organizations may offer financial assistance to support the development of these plans, often coupled with expert advice.
So it's almost like
Yeah.
they get a little bit of a head start.
Exactly. The report even provides some real-world examples
Oh, cool.
of government plans, such as China's guiding opinions on iron and steel, the EU's industrial carbon management strategy,
Wow.
Japan's sector-specific technology roadmaps,
Okay.
and the Netherlands roadmap on carbon removals.
All right. That gives us a picture
That's
of what this looks like in the real world. Now let's get into one of those key policy instruments, carbon pricing through emission trading systems,
yes.
or ETS. How does that work to encourage industrial decarbonization?
So an ETS is a market-based system
Okay.
that sets a limit
Okay.
or a cap on the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted by participating companies within a specific period.
Gotcha.
And then these companies need to hold allowances for each ton of CO2 they emit.
Okay.
Crucially, the total number of these allowances is reduced over time,
Right.
creating a direct financial incentive for companies to cut their emissions. For industrial decarbonization,
Yeah.
an ETS can be a really powerful tool by making high-emission technologies more expensive
I see.
relative to lower-emission alternatives.
So it's kind of tilting the scales?
It is tilting the scales. And this includes both the direct emissions from burning fuels on-site
Okay.
and the indirect emissions from the electricity they consume.
Gotcha.
This can really help level the playing field
Right.
and make cleaner technologies more economically attractive.
Interesting. So it's not just about saying,
It's not just about
oh, we
saying,
can't do this anymore.
it's not. It's about incentivizing.
It's about creating a system where it makes sense for companies to do it a different way.
Exactly.
The report mentions the need for a clear, long-term trajectory of emission reductions.
Yes.
Essentially, a predictable decline in the number of available allowances.
Yes.
Why is that so important for an ETS to drive deep decarbonization in industry?
So investment in heavy industry is very long-term
Okay.
and incredibly capital-intensive.
Yeah.
To truly encourage companies to invest in fundamentally new low-emission technologies,
Right.
things like green hydrogen or advanced carbon capture,
Right.
they need a high degree of certainty about the future cost of carbon.
They need to know what the rules of the game are.
Exactly. A well-designed ETS will lay out
Okay.
a predictable schedule for progressively reducing the number of available emissions allowances over time.
Gotcha.
And this increasing scarcity of allowances is what drives the carbon price upwards,
Okay.
eventually reaching levels that make near-zero emission technologies economically competitive
I see.
with traditional high-emitting industrial processes.
So it's not just about saying, okay, we've got the system in place. It's about saying,
It's about saying,
we're going to keep raising the bar.
keep raising the bar.
So you know you need to be investing in
What's
these
that?
other technologies.
Exactly. It allows companies to make informed long-term investment decisions
Right.
rather than just focusing on short-term fixes.
What are some of the key implementation considerations for setting up an effective ETS for industry?
So the actual cap on emissions and the specific schedule for reducing it are absolutely fundamental.
Okay.
Decisions need to be made about how the allowances will be initially allocated,
Okay.
whether through auctioning, which generates revenue for the government,
Right.
or through free allocation to certain industries, at least initially.
Okay.
How the revenue from auctioned allowances will be used
Yep.
is another consideration.
Yeah.
Rules around the use of carbon offsets, if any, need to be carefully established. Penalties for companies that don't comply
Right.
are essential for enforcement. And robust market oversight is needed to ensure the system functions smoothly.
So it's really about monitoring.
It's about monitoring. So this involves specialized agencies
Okay.
constantly monitoring trading activity to prevent things like insider trading or price manipulation,
Yeah.
ensuring a fair and stable market.
Gotcha. So it has to be
It has to...
watched and maintained.
It does.
Okay.
Crucially, there needs to be a strong, transparent system for monitoring, reporting, and verifying emissions,
Yeah.
ideally drawing on existing international standards like ISO
Okay.
to ensure accuracy and consistency.
That makes sense. The report also touches on the risk of carbon leakage. What is that, and how does it relate to an ETS for industrial emitters?
So carbon leakage is this risk
Okay.
that if a region or country implements a carbon price, like through an ETS, industries might decide to relocate their production to areas with no or lower carbon pricing
Right.
to avoid the increased costs. This, of course, undermines the intended emissions reductions
Yeah.
achieved in the first region and can even lead to an overall increase in global emission.
Right. So you're just shifting the problem.
You're just shifting the problem
Not
around.
actually fixing it.
Exactly. And to address this, many countries initially provide free allowances to emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries
Right.
within their ETS. However, the report makes a really important point. In the long run, these free allowances can actually weaken the incentive for deep decarbonization.
They're getting a free pass, basically.
They're getting a free pass.
And they're not being pushed
They're not being pushed.
to make those changes.
Exactly. So finding effective international solutions
Right.
that work for all stakeholders is key to genuinely mitigating this risk of carbon leakage.
So it can't just be like one country doing it.
It can.
Everyone's got to be on board.
Everyone's got to be on board.
And what about best practices for designing and implementing an ETS for industrial decarbonization?
Ensuring that robust mechanisms are in place to prevent the carbon price from staying artificially low.
Okay.
This could involve government intervention in the market under certain conditions,
Right.
or more ideally, a very clear and ambitious long-term schedule for reducing the number of available allowances.
So those incentives have to be strong enough
They
to
do.
really make a difference.
They do. It's also incredibly important to carefully consider the potential distributional effects,
Okay.
as cost increases for industries might eventually be passed on to consumers through higher prices. Governments may need to think about implementing complementary policies to mitigate these potential impacts. From an economic efficiency standpoint, a well-designed ETS should ideally minimize the need for large government expenditures to stabilize the market,
Right.
but the costs of monitoring and enforcement ideally covered by the revenue generated from auctioning the emissions allowances.
Okay, let's move on to another form of carbon pricing.
Yeah.
Carbon taxes. How do these differ in their approach to industrial decarbonization
Okay.
compared to an ETS?
So a carbon tax is a more direct approach.
Okay.
It involves setting a specific price that companies have to pay for each ton of greenhouse gases they emit.
Gotcha.
This creates a very direct and immediate financial incentive for industries
Right.
to reduce their emissions intensity
Okay.
and invest in cleaner technologies.
So it's just like,
This is
okay,
what it costs to pollute.
this is what it costs to pollute. It's a much more predictable cost than an ETS,
Yeah.
where the price of allowances can fluctuate based on market dynamics. All right, so you've got more certainty as a
Yeah.
business with a carbon tax.
Exactly.
The report notes that industries like steel and cement are often initially exempt
Yes.
from carbon taxes in many jurisdictions.
Yes.
Why is that?
So these exemptions are often related to the initial scope of the tax.
Okay.
Many countries choose to start by taxing sectors like power generation,
Right.
which is frequently the single largest emitter,
Yeah.
and another reason is trade exposure. Industries that operate in highly competitive international markets might find themselves at a disadvantage if they have to pay a carbon tax
Makes sense.
on their production, while their competitors in regions without such a tax do not.
So it's that same carbon leakage problem.
It's that same carbon leakage problem.
Potentially.
Exactly. However, the report strongly emphasizes that ultimately, including these highly emissions-intensive sectors
Right.
in comprehensive carbon tax systems is crucial if we want to have a real impact.
So again, it's that everyone needs to be on board.
Everyone needs to be on board.
Okay. Similar to ETS, the report stresses the importance of establishing a long-term,
Yes.
steadily increasing carbon price trajectory
Yes.
for carbon taxes to be truly effective in driving deep decarbonization.
Exactly.
Why is that forward-looking price signal so important?
Just as with an ETS,
Yeah.
a predictable and gradually rising carbon price provides the long-term certainty
Okay.
that industries need to justify making substantial long-term investments in low and near-zero emission technologies.
They need to know the rules are going to stay the same,
They do,
basically, or that they're going to change in a predictable way.
in a predictable way. Without that signal, companies might only be inclined to adopt short-term, less impactful emissions reduction measures.
They're going to go for the easy wins.
Exactly. And the carbon price really needs to reach a level
Right.
where these innovative, cleaner technologies become genuinely economically viable.
Makes sense. So what are some of the key practical considerations for successfully implementing a carbon tax that includes industrial emitters?
Gaining stakeholder acceptance is a major hurdle.
Yeah.
particularly in countries where there are already high existing tax burdens
Okay.
or where industries have little prior experience with environmental taxes.
Yeah, you've got to bring everyone along
You have to.
on that journey.
You do. Emissions monitoring is also crucial,
Okay.
requiring the development and implementation of robust and accurate methodologies for measuring industrial emissions.
So you need to be able to measure it to manage it.
Exactly. Carefully establishing clear rules and timelines for any exemptions that are granted,
Right.
ensuring their fairness, preventing loopholes, and putting in place effective enforcement mechanisms are all critically important. Setting the right initial price level for the carbon tax and ensuring that it increases predictably over time to achieve the desired emissions reductions is also a key consideration.
So it's about getting that initial level right,
It is.
but also making sure it's going to rise in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. And of course, the ever-present risk of carbon leakage and the potential need for implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms needs to be thoroughly analyzed and addressed. Finally, it's vital to analyze the potential distributional impacts of the carbon tax, as the initial cost increases will fall on the private sector and could potentially be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices.
So it's really important to understand where that cost ultimately is going to land.
It is. Governments might need to consider implementing complementary financial assistance measures or social safety nets to mitigate any regressive impacts.
It's a lot like the fuel tax debates. Nobody likes paying more, even if it's for a good cause.
Exactly. So communication and support mechanisms are key.
Makes sense. The report mentions that trying to mimic too many features of an ETS within a carbon tax system can inadvertently lead to unnecessary complexity. Why is that?
One of the core advantages of a carbon tax is its relative simplicity and administrative ease compared to a market-based system like an ETS.
So it's supposed to be.
It's supposed to be.
Simpler and easier to implement.
Exactly. If a government tries to incorporate many of the features often found in an ETS, such as granting numerous specific tax exemptions that effectively mirror free allowances or creating highly complex rules, the carbon tax system can become quite intricate and require a much larger and more bureaucratic.
You're basically just recreating the ETS through the carbon tax.
Exactly. This can end up undermining the inherent simplicity and transparency that a carbon tax is supposed to offer.
Okay, we've covered emission trading systems and carbon taxes. Now let's talk about tradable performance standards, or TPS. How do these work to encourage industrial decarbonization?
So tradable performance standards take a very different regulatory approach compared to direct carbon pricing mechanisms. Instead of putting a cap on the total amount of emissions or setting a direct price per ton of emissions, a TPS sets a mandatory requirement for all production within a specific industrial sector to meet a declining average emissions intensity level.
So it's a different metric.
It's a different metric.
Okay, what does that mean?
So emissions intensity is essentially the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced per unit of product. For example, tons of CO2 emitted per ton of steel produced.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like how efficiently they're producing that thing.
Exactly. A system of tradable certificates is then established. Companies that are able to achieve an emissions intensity lower than the standard earn credits or certificates for their outperformance. And they can sell these excess certificates to other companies whose emissions intensity is above the required standard.
So it's like a cap and trade, but on a different metric.
On a different metric.
Gotcha. So it's a cap on the rate rather than the total aggregate emissions.
Exactly.
What are the key practical considerations governments need to keep in mind?
So setting a clear and well-defined scheme with carefully staggered milestones that progressively tighten the standards over time.
So again, that predictable increase is crucial.
Over time, exactly. When implementing a TPS, you need to carefully consider how to set the initial emissions intensity benchmarks, how to handle new entrants to the market, and how to put in place robust systems for ongoing monitoring.
So similar themes.
Similar themes.
To what we've already talked about.
Exactly. Just as with ETS and carbon taxes, the potential risk of carbon leakage and the potential for distributional impacts need to be thoroughly assessed.
What are some of the best practices that can help ensure a tradable performance standard system effectively drives emission reductions?
So robust mechanisms need to be in place to guarantee that the emissions intensity benchmark continues to decrease,
Okay.
predictably and substantially over time.
Okay, so we're not just setting a standard
Oh,
and
no.
then just letting it sit there.
Not letting it sit there. It should be achieved through a well-planned and publicly announced schedule of progressively increasing the stringency.
So it's clear to the companies
Clear to the company.
that's what they need to achieve.
Exactly. Additionally, the report emphasizes that establishing a common international understanding of the definitions for what constitutes low emissions and near zero emissions materials
Okay.
will significantly enhance the transparency
Makes sense.
and effectiveness of a TPS system.
So everyone's talking about the same thing.
Everyone's talking about the same thing.
When they say low emissions.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It clearly defines the ultimate goals
Yeah.
and the necessary interim steps
Yeah.
for the participating industries.
Gotcha. The IEA report then moves on to discuss just transition planning. Why is this an essential component of any comprehensive industrial decarbonization strategy?
Industrial decarbonization, while absolutely necessary from an environmental perspective,
Yeah.
will have significant social and economic consequences,
Right.
particularly for the workers in communities that are heavily reliant on traditional high-emitting industries.
Right. People's jobs are at stake.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just transition planning
Okay.
is a proactive approach to addressing these potential negative consequences,
Right.
to ensure a transition that is fair, equitable, and minimizes social disruption.
So it's about bringing everyone along.
It is. And this is particularly relevant for regions with a large industrial employment base
Yeah.
and those that anticipate workforce migrations as certain industries evolve.
So there's going to be
Go
pay
on,
losses potentially
Yeah.
in certain sectors.
Exactly.
But there's going to be new jobs
There will be.
created in other areas. So how do you manage that? What are some of the practical considerations that governments need to keep in mind when developing and implementing just transition plans in this context?
So meaningful engagement with the affected industrial companies
Okay.
and crucially trade unions
Yeah.
is absolutely paramount.
You got to talk to the people.
Got to talk to the people.
You're going to be affected.
Exactly. This engagement is essential to understand their concerns and the potential challenges they foresee.
Yeah.
The timing of the transition
Yeah.
needs to be very carefully considered
Yeah.
in relation to how quickly the workforce can be retrained and upskilled.
Yeah. So there needs to be that
There needs to be
support to move people
Yeah.
into those new roles.
in those new roles. Potential local and regional migration challenges
Right.
must also be proactively anticipated.
Okay. And what are some of the best practices that can help ensure that just transition planning is effective and achieves its goals?
So ensuring that just transition strategies are fully integrated within the broader roadmaps and plans
Right.
for industrial decarbonization is key. If they're not fully integrated,
Yeah.
they should at least be clearly referenced,
Okay.
facilitating international knowledge sharing on effective stakeholder engagement strategies
Okay.
and best practices in designing and implementing just transition plans can also be very valuable.
So again, we're back to that sharing knowledge.
Sharing knowledge.
Nice. Yeah.
Exactly. Finally, access to dedicated international financing mechanisms that are earmarked for supporting just transition initiatives can provide crucial financial assistance
Right.
to help countries advance their social and economic goals.
Makes sense.
Okay.
The final element within the framework fundamentals section is mobilizing finance and investment. Why is this such a crucial prerequisite for achieving industrial decarbonization?
So even with the establishment of strong carbon pricing signals
Okay.
through mechanisms like ETS and carbon taxes,
Right.
the critical task of mobilizing finance and investment in nascent net zero technologies is crucial. The fundamental transformation of heavy industry requires massive amounts of upfront capital,
Right.
has inherently long investment horizons,
Yeah.
and carries significant risks,
Gotcha.
all of which can deter private sector investment.
So these are big, expensive projects,
They are
and you need a lot of money to get them started.
a lot of money. This challenge is particularly acute for emerging markets and developing economies,
Right.
where higher sovereign risk
Yeah.
can add another layer of complexity.
So the government's got to step in and play a role
They do?
in encouraging that investment.
Exactly. Government policies play a vital role in providing long-term foresight,
Oh.
reducing perceived risks for
Oh, wow.
investors,
Yeah.
guaranteeing certain levels of return on investment
Okay.
and ultimately lowering the overall cost of capital.
It's about making it less risky.
It's about making it less risky.
Here, for that private investment.
Exactly. And by doing so,
Yeah.
governments can create much stronger investment cases
Makes sense.
for the private sector to deploy the necessary capital. This also includes actively supporting the development of essential enabling infrastructure,
Right.
like carbon capture and storage networks and green hydrogen production facilities.
Okay, so the government can kind of lay that foundation
Lay that foundation.
to make it easier for the private sector to come in.
Exactly.
The report outlines a wide array of financial instruments that governments can use to mobilize this investment. Could you give us an overview of some of the key ones?
Yeah, so direct public funding, encompassing instruments like subsidies and grants,
Okay.
can be strategically deployed to support the adoption of innovative technologies and to fund early-stage research and development projects.
Okay, so that's really about
Yeah.
getting those early stage things off the ground.
Off the ground.
Okay.
Direct public equity investment
Yeah,
involves the government itself becoming an investor
right.
in specific projects or companies where private capital alone is deemed insufficient. Subsidized interest rates and concessional loans offer borrowing at below market rates,
Right.
effectively reducing the cost of capital for green projects,
Making it cheaper.
making it cheaper.
Uh.
Public guarantees
Okay.
can help mitigate the perceived credit risk
Yeah.
associated with investments
Okay.
in new and unproven technologies.
Right.
Governments can also play a role in facilitating connections between projects and available sources of private capital.
So they can be that matchmaker
Matchmaking.
between the money and the project.
Exactly. Contracts for difference, or CFDs,
Okay.
are a powerful tool for providing long-term price certainty
Yep.
for the output of low-carbon assets and products.
Gotcha.
Tax credits can be designed to incentivize low-emission production processes
Right.
and the adoption of carbon capture technologies.
Makes sense.
Public-private partnerships, or PPPs, and
Yeah.
blended finance structures
Right.
combine public sector,
Right.
philanthropic,
Okay.
and private sector capital.
So it's all about kind of sharing the risk.
And the reward. Exactly. Finally, sustainable investment schemes and green taxonomies can help guide private capital flows.
Okay, so it's about giving investors confidence that
Right.
these projects are actually going to make a difference.
Exactly. And the specific suitability
Right.
of each of these instruments will depend on a variety of factors,
Okay.
including the government's own budgetary constraints,
Yeah.
the risk appetites of stakeholders,
Yeah.
and the simplicity of implementation.
So it's really about choosing the right tool
Yes.
for the job.
For the job. For example, CFDs are particularly useful for providing long-term revenue certainty
Okay.
for very capital-intensive projects,
Makes sense.
while targeted tax credits can be effective in supporting the wider deployment of technologies that are proven
Okay.
but still face cost barriers.
That's a really comprehensive overview of the framework fundamentals that the IEA report lays out. Let's move on to the second broad area, identified in the report, targeted actions for specific technologies and strategies.
Okay.
What's the primary focus in this category?
So this category shifts the focus
Okay.
towards more direct government interventions
Right.
within particular sectors
Okay.
and for the promotion of key decarbonization technologies.
Gotcha.
It's about actively managing the emissions from existing high-emitting facilities,
Okay.
proactively creating markets for near-zero emissions materials,
Yeah.
and fostering the research and
All right.
development and deployment of the technologies that are essential for deep